Yeah. Okay, so we're on Mem Vav Amid Beis. We turned the corner last week, and again we raised the question whether money, mos, can be chalipin, and the Gemara tried to provide a circumstance where money can be chalipin, because remember we discussed this little twist where a person is going to exchange a cow for a donkey, and I'm going to sell you my donkey, and you're going to sell me back your cow, and you're going to pay me, and then you sell me back your cow, but instead of giving me the money, you give me the animal. So it's really an exchange of an animal for an animal, with money being sort of in between there, where the money was going to be paid, but then the money was withdrawn in order to transfer back the animal. And according to Manda Omar, I mean, what we were thinking is that was chalipin, because we were taking the money, and again, it's a little bit of a hard sell, but we were taking the money, and instead of paying it as a transaction, we were flipping it into a item, which then became chalipin, and we said it was the money that would made the chalipin. The money made the chalipin. So using that kind of sleight of hand, or just quick trick transfer, we said, according to the Gemara, that would be a proof that money can be used for chalipin. Money can be used for chalipin because you see, and the Gemara gave the example, Yesh Dalam Shein Kechalipin, and he brought down the Mishnah in the Kedushin, Demei Shor B'Para or Demei Chamor B'Shor. So, in other words, that's how we wanted to answer the question. We said, yes, it's a proof that there was. Now, so again, we're probably about 10 lines or so, 10, 11 lines from the top. So we said that Rav Nachman says that you can do that. But remember, we said, why does he say that? Because he hung his hat on Rabbi Yochanan. So it says, my Talmud Rav Nachman, just to go over that line again. What was Rav Nachman's reasoning that he said money can be used for chalipin through this sort of sleight of hand type of transaction? He said because Rav Nachman holds to Rabbi Yochanan. What does Rabbi Yochanan say? Rabbi Yochanan says, "Dvar Torah mos konos," that minat Torah money is koina. So that's all you need to know. Minat Torah. So then why do we say that you have to have Mashiach? If minat Torah it's mos konos, why did the Rabbanan come along and say that you have to have a kinyan with Mashiach or Hagbah or whatever it happens to be? It says the Gemara, Gezerah shemayomalo nisruf chaticha ba'aliyah. So because we're afraid, remember we said that if mos is konos and the transaction is complete with just the exchange of money, with the chayfetz, the item still in the hands of the seller, then we're afraid if the fire breaks out, he will have no incentive to save the produce because he's gotten his money. The fact that the other guy hasn't transferred the produce will sort of be secondary to him. So he'll say, you know what, I have my money. I'm not going to exert myself to try to save the produce. Therefore, the Rabbanan came along and said, you know what, you can't rely on the money being the trigger to complete the transaction. You have to have Mashiach on the item in order to protect the buyer who's going to get the produce from being left out in the cold if something happens to the produce and he already owns it. And it's not in his reshus to protect it. So
okay, excuse me, Rabbi.
For the buyer.
Excuse me?
Yeah.
Do we ever discuss the fact that money inherently has no value? I mean, what can you do with dollar bills except do something with them?
But
money has no inherent
money
value.
back then did. There wasn't dollar bills.
No, I know that it had value, but it was only something that you did something with it. So
you did something with. What you're saying is something money in itself. You can have all the money, but if you don't do anything with it, what's the money?
It doesn't have any value unless you do something with it. which is different than all the other examples of a horse, a cow, or this and that. Why don't they separate it and say, look, it inherently has no value, and therefore it does or doesn't have
Jay,
meaning when
that's
it,
the whole theory behind the discussion, that you really need the item, produce, a kli, whatever it is,
something.
to be the object of transfer, for the very reason that you're saying, is because money in and of itself, what does it do? It helps make a transaction of something that is useful. You can't eat money. You can't, I mean, you can feel good about it, but you can't make it into something positive to you, like you can an animal or fruit or food or anything like that. So you're right, which is why the Chachamim came along and said that in the general sense, it's the produce, the item, the kli, no matter whether you hold like Rav Nachman or Rav Sheshes, whoever you hold like, whether or not, what actually makes the transaction, the item that you're procuring from the money. Because like you say, the money in and of itself it's valuable, it's everything, but it doesn't do anything. So that's the theory behind the Rabbanon coming along and saying that in order for two people to make a transaction, it's not enough for just the money to be the catalyst. But in reality, the Gemara wants to make it clear that min HaTorah, we're talking practically speaking, Jay. Practically speaking, the rabbis say it's the produce. But min HaTorah, there is a dispute between Rosh Yochanan and Rosh Lakish as to whether or not money min HaTorah is koneh. So we're saying that Rav Nachman is hanging his hat on Rabbi Yochanan, who says money is koneh, and since money is koneh, that's proof positive that money can be used for chalipin. That's the thinking going on here. In a minute, we're going to flip the switch, and we're going to talk about Rosh Lakish, who argues on Rabbi Yochanan, and he says, no, even min HaTorah, money is not koneh. Even min HaTorah, which Rabbi Yochanan says it is, comes Rosh Lakish and says it is not. That you have to have Mashiach or Agbo or some other kinyan other than money. But for our purposes right now, in order to try to reconcile the Gemara and say that this transaction that we've talked about, the exchange of a chamor for a shor, using money and then not using money to show that money is for chalipin, Rabbi Yochanan says the reason why that's valid is because he hangs his hat on Rabbi Yochanan, who says that Dvar Torah Mos Konos, and the only reason why we have Mashiach is because of this gezerah that you're not going to come to protect the product if you already say that money is koneh. Now, so okay, so to your point, Jay, it's correct that ultimately, what does money do? But if he's saying that min HaTorah, money does have the ability to be koneh, then we have to rely on the fact that the Torah is telling us that there is something about money that inherently makes it a positive transaction, even though you're correct that what do you do with money? You don't eat it, but still the chashivas of money allows a transaction to be completed min HaTorah. That's how we're positive. Now, so then, okay, so what's the point? How does he want to make this raya, which we concluded? This is how we concluded last week, and we said milsa de shchicha gazabe rabbanan, that even though the Torah says that money is koneh, so in the normal sense, when you are buying and selling, the rabbis instituted the gzeira and said that most, even though midaraisa it's koneh, midrabanan under our watch, it's not koneh for the reason we just said, because we're afraid that no one will protect the buyer. But milsa de lo shchicha lo gazabe rabbanan. So this is the little twist that the Gemara. We completed our thinking last week. What's milsa de lo shchicha? Milsa de lo shchicha is our example of trading a shor for a chamor, which you were starting off by buying because you were going to take money. And then you said, you know what, instead of giving you money, let me give you my chamor because you need a chamor. You told me you needed the chamor, so I'm not going to pay you for the shore. I'll give you the chamor. That's called milsha de lo shchicha. Why? Because it's an unusual form of transaction. Normally, a transaction is, Jay, you want to buy my shore? Fine, $100. Give me the money. Then later on, I think, but you know, you have a chamor. I'd like to buy it. Here, take $100, and I'm going to buy it. That's the normal way people transact. But if a person is going to transact by saying, you know what, you need my shore, pay me $100. And then literally in the moment, you say, well, wait a minute, you have a chamor. So don't give me the $100, give me the chamor. So that's called milsha de lo shchicha. That's called a transaction that is not in the normal course of buying and selling. Says the Gemara that in milsha de lo shchicha, in such a transaction, the rabbis do not make a gezerah and say that you have to have, that money doesn't work. We fall back on Rabbi Yochanan, who says money does work. So that's the exception to the rule. In a milsha de lo shchicha, when it's an unorthodox form of transaction, and in that particular case, it's okay. Therefore, Rav Nachman says, to me, this is an example of where money can be used for chalipin because it's milsa de lo shchicha. So Rav Nachman, that's his position. He says that I hold like Rav Yochanan money is konet, and since you did it in an unorthodox form, therefore it's money, but it's not a transaction. So I'm going to say that money is used for chalipin. It's kind of a really roundabout way of coming to it, but when you think about it in terms of what's the norm and what's not the norm, this is not the norm, so he can hang his hat and say it's not the norm. Therefore, money can be used for chalipin because it's not the normal kind of transaction where I would sell you a shore and then you'd come back and sell me a chamor. It's a trade-off, and that trade-off in lieu of money means that money can transact for chalipin. Kind of a hard sell, but that's kind of the thinking. Yeah,
a hard sell. That's funny.
It's a hard sell. Right?
Is that if instead 2 minutes before, if instead we're haggling over the price, so yeah, I think you're sure. Yeah, it's about $100. Sure, it sounds good. Oh, wait a minute, you got a chamor. Let's trade shore for chamor instead. If you simply did that,
but the money was on the table already.
Right, but no, but before we agreed on the money, we said, hey, you know what? My chamor is worth about the same as your shore. Forget the money. Let's just trade animals. Then it becomes a pure barter transaction. Money doesn't enter into it, and somebody has to physically move one of the animals in order to make the transaction happen.
But Rav Nachman gleans from that because money was on the table and then was just ripped off the table because of the exchange, that allows money to be used for chalipin. You see, the thinking here is that the money was going to be a regular transaction, but once you pull the money back for the chamor, then in his mind, that money would have been a transaction, and now it's not, so therefore money could have been used for chalipin. It's a very roundabout way of thinking.
In a way, it's sort of saying that instead of that, money buying and selling is one class of transaction, trading is another class of transaction. But in this case, the money, it effectively is two trades.
Right.
And then the money is okay to trade where normally it wouldn't be.
Right. And he calls that milsa de lo shchicha because that's not the normal way of transacting with money. So according to him, if it's an unusual way of transacting with money, that's chalipin. That's exactly his definition of chalipin, is an unusual way of trading money, not as a buy and sell, but as a kind of like substitute. You're substituting an item for money, which means that the money really could have been traded, quote, traded, not sold, traded for the item. Again, we're not conditioned to think that way, but this is what the Gemara wants to tell us is why you can have, according to Rav Nachman, it can be chalipin. But now we're picking up today, and we're gonna say, wait a minute, not so fast. So says the Gemara, and Rish Lakish,
Tuvia, a quick,
Yes,
and obviously the Gemara can create a Metzias to illustrate a point, a larger point, and it does, even though if it's highly unlikely. This does happen.
yes.
Specifically, though, I'm still a little bit unclear on why the money was withdrawn. Oh, wait, with the chamor was withdrawn. And let's go. Wait, how do we go? Would you go with the money withdrawn or the?
No, he sold him a shore. He sold him a
Yeah,
shore,
right.
and he was going to give him the money. And the fellow said, "But you have a chamor which I need, so give me the chamor." In other words, let's exchange the shore that I just sold you, but instead
With
of
money.
for money, but instead of giving me money, you're going to give me the chamor in trade.
Right. So my question remains: why negate the original terms of this deal? What caused it to go away?
Because all of a sudden he realized, I need a chamor and you have one. In other words, it wasn't on his horizon. On his horizon was to sell him a shore. I have a shore. I'm coming to market. I want to sell my shore. You need a shore. Pay me $100. But then, and the Gemara, by the way, is today we're going to enunciate that more clearly, where the other guy says, "But wait a minute. You told me you need a chamor." The Gemara doesn't say it, but you told me you need a chamor. I have one. So let's just make that exchange. The Gemara then says, according to Rab Nachman, since he was about to pay the money to make the shore, to buy the shore, and the chamor came into the picture all of a sudden as a trade, so that money was withdrawn. And he says, because we're going to look at this as a milsa de lo shchicha, a transaction that is not sort of the norm, because the norm would be, I sell you my shore, and then as a separate transaction, I buy your chamor. In other words, two separate transactions. Since it's a milsa de lo shchicha, we can extrapolate or interpret that in that milsa de lo shchicha, it wasn't a sale, it was an exchange. They really didn't sell one to the other. They exchanged with one for the other, with money being kind of there for an instant and then withdrawn. Therefore, says Rab Nachman, I can interpret that money to be chalipin, because it was going to be a sale, but it's no longer a sale, it's an exchange. I want to call that money, we use that money for chalipin, even though the money didn't change hands. There was no money that changed hands, but to Rab Nachman, that money is symbolic of the fact that he flipped the money into a chamor, which makes the money a chalipin, an exchange item. The money became an exchange item because he flipped it into a chamor, which then became the trade-off for the shore. So
excuse me, Rabbi.
Yeah.
So what we have here sounds like, in listening to what Rick just said, we have two levels of communications between people. You have a more formal part, then you have an informal discussion that goes back to a different formal arrangement. And how do they include both informal communication and formal into the same package?
Because they say it's really, again, I mean, that's the Gemara is telling you, that they view that as one transaction, not a normal transaction. You're right. It's not the normal transaction. That's why they call it milsa de lo shchicha. It's an unusual transaction, which doesn't normally happen, but it happened in that instant because when I sold you the shore, what happened if I didn't need a chamor? I didn't need a chamor, and then the next day I said, oh my gosh, I need a chamor. Two separate transactions, 2 days, one has nothing to do with the other. The fact that they came together, you could say serendipity, the fact that they just came together at the moment that they did, says Rab Nachman, that's all I need. That's all I need to hang my hat and say, because of the way it happened, it's a milsa de lo shchicha. It may not happen again for days, weeks, months, years, but it happened here. Therefore, I can extrapolate that it shows that money is chalipin because of the way it happened. You're right, Jay. This is not normal. This is not the norm.
The formal part of the conversation,
Right.
you're already starting a negotiation. Okay, and there's a commitment in the formal part.
Right.
In the informal discussion, there's no commitment. You have to change it back to a formal.
That's right. But because the formal commitment wasn't
he
totally
could say,
finalized,
say,
wait a
I'll
minute,
take.
it wasn't totally finalized.
That's what I'm getting at. But it's informal and it has no inherent commitment to carry through with the, okay, I'll take your chamor, and then suddenly in that conversation he said, I changed my mind. He didn't make a commitment halfway through this conversation. Is what
right.
I'm
But
So how can you create a medium and a methodology of exchange based upon an idiosyncrasy, an idiosyncratic event?
But Rick, it's the idiosyncratic event that allows Reb Nachman to say this is so unusual. This isn't a sale because it is an idiosyncratic event. That's exactly the point. You make it well. The fact that it's a milsa de lo shchicha, which again, idiosyncratic, same thing. It doesn't happen. That proves the point that this isn't a normal sale where I sell to you, you sell to me. There's something different about this. What's different? What's different is that in the same breath, informal, formal, in the same breath, I said, but let's transact the donkey. Okay, so before the ink was dry on the Shiur sale, we were talking about exchanging for a donkey, so that at the end of the day, the deal sort of, we have this, again, in the real world, we have negotiations. We make a deal. In the middle of the deal, we could be sitting on opposite sides of the table, and then, all of a sudden you think about something and says, wait a minute, before we finalize this deal, you have a plant in Indonesia. That plant in Indonesia, let's make that part of this deal. It's out in left field, has nothing to do with anything, but you all of a sudden, so just the ink was dry, it was not dry on the deal. We didn't conclude the deal. Let's include that in the deal. So by including that in the deal, you've now changed the contours of the deal. You want to call it a J, formal or informal. It's part of the larger deal. It's part of the larger deal. But when the dust settles at the end of the day, and Yankel walks away with the Shiur, and Baruch walks away with the Chamor, that's the end of the deal. What has happened here? Well, the Shiur was going to be sold for money. Money was withdrawn, and the Chamor took the place of the money. And now everybody gets what he wants, and the money, which was flipped into the Chamor, says Reb Nachman, that's the proof that money can be used for chalipin, because otherwise, why would you have been able to do it? So in his view, since money can be koneh, right, like Rabbi Yochanan, I can take that money and I can flip it for something else. I'm using the term flip here intentionally because you're flipping it into the chamor, and therefore, what is chalipin? Chalipin is making an exchange. I've just made an exchange of the money for the chamor, which shows that money can be used for an exchange, not only a sale. And since money can be used for exchange, when at the end of the day I get my chamor and not money, I've inherently used that money that was on the table for chalipin, because I have flipped it into a chamor. So that's how Reb Nachman, again, strained as it is, it's a milsa de lo shchicha. It's not an ordinary transaction, but it still qualifies as a transaction. Says Reb Nachman, that's proof that money can be used for chalipin, because otherwise I shouldn't have been able to do what I did. I should have had to conclude my purchase of the ox and then create a separate transaction for money buying the chamor. There should have been two mutually exclusive acts, but instead they're merged into one act, with money being the conduit between the Shiur and the chamor. And in my view, that's chalipin. Now, clearly, Reb Shlokish and the others argue on him, so we know that that's not universally accepted. But if you want to understand what his theory was, that's his theory. So, okay, we've established his theory. And again, Jay, you can ask all the questions, and you're right. But what you're doing is you're trying to undermine Reb Nachman, who says you can't undermine me, because in my view, what just happened is one transaction, and the transaction would have been with money, but is not. So to me, the would have been with money shows that you can flip it with chalipin into another item. That's kind of the sort of the panorama that we're dealing with now. So let's immediately move
Thank you.
to the next step. Rash Lakish the Omar Meshicha Mufareshes min Torah. Rash Lakish clearly he distinguishes from Rabbi Yochanan, whereas Rabbi Yochanan says that min HaTorah Dvar Torah mos konos. He says no such thing. Min HaTorah Meshicha Mufareshes min HaTorah. Only Meshicha. By Meshicha he means a kinyan, which could be Hagbah, or it could be any form of kinyan, where you're taking an item and pulling it, pushing it, lifting it, whatever you do. But it's not money. Now, so he clearly argues in Rabbi Yochanan. So Rab Nachman can't hang his hat on Rosh Lakish. Says the Gemara, he nicha isavalei Rab Sheshes. So this view of Rosh Lakish is okay if you hold like Rav Sheshes. Why? What does it mean if you hold like Rav Sheshes? If he holds like Rav Sheshes, that an item, a pre, an item, a product, not a kli, an item, a produce can be used for chalipin, then it's okay, according to Rav Lakish. Why? Because then mitaretz like Rav Sheshes. He holds our Mishnah, the Mishnah in Kedushin that we've been talking about, where the Mishnah talks about chalipin of an animal for an animal. An animal is not a kli. An animal is a chayfetz. So now, if he holds that a chayfetz, an item of product, the produce, can be used for chalipin, that comes out of court well, according to Rish Lakish. But Isav like Rav Nachman, if Rish Lakish's view is going to hold like Rav Nachman, what does Rav Nachman say? I'm a pre-law of the chalipin. Remember, Rav Nachman says that only a kali, because the pasuk in the Megillah by Rus, where it talks about chalipin, talks about a kli, a keli, a utensil, an item, not a product. An animal is not a kli. Fruit is not a kli. So according to Rav Nachman, you have to have a kli, not an item. Then that doesn't come out according to Rish Lakish, because then according to Rish Lakish, how is it going to happen? Right? Because he holds that since the produce doesn't acquire and money doesn't acquire, what does it mean? Machlef shor b'chamor. What are you doing? If you can't exchange a product and money it does not acquire, because Rish Lakish says he doesn't hold like Rabbi, because he argues on Rabbi Yochanan, then what is the interpretation of the Mishnah in Kedushin? That Mishnah in Kedushin is the gold standard. What does the Mishnah say? The Mishnah says if someone is machlef shor for a chamor, someone exchanges a shor for a chamor, that's chalipin. So wait a minute. What does that mean? According to Rav Nachman, you can't exchange a shor for chamor because chalipin doesn't apply by produce. It only applies by a kli. And it's not, and you can't use money because he holds like Rish Lakish, right? Rav Nachman holds like Rish Lakish, that what? That only Meshicha makes a kinyan, not money. Then how do you interpret the Mishnah in Kedushin? What does that mean? He exchanged one for the other. How did that come about? It couldn't have come about because it wasn't chalipin and it wasn't money. There's no third alternative. It's either a sale, which you can't be because you can't use money, or a chalipin, which you can't do because it's produce. So according to Rav Nachman, he doesn't understand the Mishnah. The Mishnah has no real meaning if how does one go about exchanging that shor for the chamor? You can't use money and you can't use chalipin. Therefore, says the Gemara, so he says, "Lo of the umatbeya lo kana heichem mitaretz law al karcha." You're forced to say kirav sheishes mitaretz law, that he answers like Rav Sheshes, so he can't hold like Rav Nachman. He has to hold like Rav Sheshes. Rav Sheshes says that a fruit, a pre or a product, can be used for chalipin. So even Rish Lakish, who's out there how is he going to interpret the Mishnah? Therefore, he can't hold like Rav Nachman because there's no fit with Rav Nachman. It has to be that he holds like Rav Shlakish, that a peri, a produce, can be used for chalipin. Otherwise, that Mishnah in Kedushin made no sense because there was no way of transacting a shore for a chamor. So what we're left with is we're a machlokes between Rav Nachman, between Rabbi Yochanan and Rav Shlakish as to whether or not money can be used for kinyan according to Rav Shlakish, according to Rabbi Yochanan, yes, and according to Rav Shlakish, no. And then we have the machlokes between Rav Sheshes and Rav Nachman. Rav Sheshes says that a fruit, a non-utensil, let's call it, can be used for chalipin. And Rav Nachman says no, only a kli can be used for chalipin. So according to Rav Nachman, he's in a bind. How do we interpret that Mishnah in Kedushin? There's just no way to understand it, which is why Rav Shlakish, who was supporting Rav Nachman's view, has to retract and says, no, I can't hold like Rav Nachman, because according to Rav Nachman, there's no understanding of that Mishnah in Kedushin, where you exchanged one for the other, where it wasn't chalipin, because it's not a kli, and money, it wasn't a sale, because money can't be transacted, so you're left out in the cold. Therefore, the halacha has to be like Rav Sheshes, that chalipin can be with a kli. It can be with a kli. That's how this Gemara comes to a conclusion. And so the question now, again, it's not clear because you can take two sides as to whether or not money can be used for chalipin. According to the view that we had before, that most konos it can be used. And according to the view that Rav Shlakish posits that only Mashiach is good, you can never use, then you can't use money for chalipin. So we're again not decisive. We haven't had a decisive interpretation of whether or not you can use money for chalipin. But that doesn't end the story. It doesn't end the story. So let's take a look at Rashi, and then we can go a little bit further. Someone like Rabbi Yochanan, that money is kona v'anantanam mos ain't a kona. So how does Rabbi Nachman understand? This is the third of the wide, not the widest lines, but of the wider lines in Rashi. So he says, Shavaka Rabbi Yochanan, the Amal Kaman, because this machlokes is going to come into real clarity in another week or two when we learn Mem Zayin. Dvar Torah, most konos. Gabi kona min hektish. Torah, the Torah says you can buy from hektish, but not kesef for komlo. So the Torah says that when you buy from hektish, you can give money. So that's proof that money is kona, right? From hektish, because you're buying something from hektish. Clearly, you're not exchanging an item for an item. You're taking money and buying from hektish, and you're kona that item when you pay the money to hektish. So therefore, Rabbi Yochanan says money is kona because you just gave it to Hagdish. You gave it for the use of the Beis Hamikdash or for Kodesh, and now you took the produce. So that was the proof from Rabbi Yochanan. And why does Rish Lakish say Meshicha kona below Ma'os? Zera Shema Yenicha Mokeach Beis Mocher Zman Meruba. The seller will leave it in the house of the. In other words, he won't take the item out of the house of who he's buying it from. The tipo delika, and a fire will start. B'shchunas hamarcha. Well, yochach l'troach, and he won't be he won't quickly try lahatzel to save the item. And so who's going to take the loss? Not him, the buyer, because the buyer already was kona. If you're saying Mo's konas, the given yisyaru b'rishuso yisyakru v'yachsabo minamecher v'yaschar shalo. So the Gemara said. So Rashi is saying that in order to understand how this transaction would happen, we're saying we're going to give it a different spin. We're going to say, listen to this. We're going to say that the seller, the buyer who is giving the money, he gave the money, and he bought the item. Now, you're gonna say, wait a minute, oh, but you're afraid it's gonna have a fire. So he says, okay, but wait a minute, I'm gonna introduce a new concept. The concept is that if the buyer has the item and it belongs to the seller, one second, the seller of the item left it, the seller of the item didn't take it back, so it's sitting by the fellow who gave him the money. Let's say that item increased in value and it was worth $100, and now that item increased to $150. Who does the item belong to? Does it belong to the owner who paid the money for it, or does it own to the fellow in whose possession it still sits? Says Rashi, we're going to say it belongs to the fellow in whose possession it sits. Therefore, he has an incentive to save the item because he can now get the benefit of the increased price of the item. So Rashi is now putting a different spin on the transaction and saying it's not the other fellow who's going to lose and we have to protect his interest because a fire will start and he'll lose his item. No, the seller has an incentive because if he still has the item in his reshus because the other guy didn't make a mashicha and it goes up in price, he can say, "Wait a minute, it's my benefit. I want to cancel the transaction because you didn't take your item. It's still sitting with me. I'm kind of a shomer. I'm a shomer in this case. I want the item because now you're going to have to pay me $150 for that item because it increased in value." So Rashi is turning the tables really on the interpretation of why Mos Konos is, no, we're not afraid that he's going to allow it to get burnt and not, try to save it. Of course he's going to try to save it because if it increases in price, he gets the benefit of it. And if he gets the benefit of the item, then he's going to save it at all costs because he's now made an increased profit, right? Even though he sold it, but since it hasn't yet come into the reshus of the new owner, he can say, wait a minute, it's my reshus. That's what Rashi needs to say here. Gezerah Shema, Yenichem Lekech Bebeis Hamachas Mamaruba, V'tipel, L'leike B'shchus Hamacha, V'lo yochish l'troach l'hatzel, Lefikach Meir, Lefikach HaMidim B'shuso Latzabo, Im Yirtza Dekivan Im Yisyakru B'shuso. If it increases in value in his reshus, Yisrakru, he will be the beneficiary of the increased price. The Yachsabo min hamecher, the Yaschar Shalo, he'll return the money. He says, "Thank you. Here's your $100. You want to buy it? It now costs you $150. Kiki didei choshev lahu, because to him it is more valuable. V'torach umatzel, and he'll save it from any fire or from anything else because he's going to have a profit from the item that's in his reshus. The given the takanta rabbanon ba'almahu b'mecher, and since the rabbis made a takana generally in a sale to shchiach, ovid rabbanon takanta b'mecher the lo shchiach. So he's saying that since the rabbis made a takana in a case where it is shchiach, meaning a normal transaction, therefore the rabbis also made a takana in a case that's lo shchiach, which our case. To go on high, shamin demei metaltalin to metaltalin. Our case where he traded metaltalin for metaltalin, well, ovid rabbanon takanta b'mashicha. The rabbis did not say you have to make a mashicha. So again, this just supports our understanding of why a milsa below shchicha is a valid transaction and it's considered chalipin, even though there was a money component, and even though he didn't take the item, is because we're saying that in that particular case, the rabbis are not going to say you need a mashicha to make the transaction, but rather money itself will make the transaction. Now, mind you, if money makes the transaction, then the seller really has to. I mean, the seller has to take his goods, because if he doesn't take his goods, then theoretically he could lose them. Although, again, there's always the opportunity for the seller to say, wait a minute, you didn't take your goods, that even though money is the transaction, the money, the increased value should belong to me.
So the seller becomes a shomer chinam.
It becomes a shomer, right? Exactly, exactly. So so that's how Rashi wants to interpret it as to what the protection is here for the fellow who bought the goods but does not yet have them in his rishus. Now, the Rish Lakish, the Omar says Rashi lekama bepirkin, Meshicha mufareshes min Torah, that it's Meshicha, not Mos. The Kibbutz Midaraisa Mos Lokani, according to Rish Lakish, money is not Kona Midaraisa, Lo Shana Macher the Shchiach, Lo Shana Mecher the Lo Shchiach. Mos Lokani. He doesn't make a distinction between a case that is the normal case of transaction or something that's unusual. That if you hold like Reb Sheshes, I'm a payre of the chalipin, that payre makes chalipin, mitaris l'mislisin ke Reb Sheshes. Therefore, the Mishnah of trading a chamor for a shore comes out like Reb Sheshes, because you're allowed to trade produce, items, non-utensil items, produce. You're allowed to trade. We could have shown Rabbi Yehuda kol hanishum domim be'echad, like Rabbi Yehuda interpreted that anyone who appraises something ba'acher could go metaltalin uperish odam ragal shuman, because produce is something that a person appraises, right? Yishanosin domim ba'acher hechad awesome chalipin kiven shezochazeh zochazeh. In other words, according to this view, that chalipin can be used in produce, because what does a person do? In chalipin, you sort of do an evaluation. I'm trading my cow for my donkey, and I'm going to appraise the cow. It's approximately the value of the donkey, so I'm going to make this exchange. So according to that view, it's perfectly fine in Rav Sheshes. But if you're going to hold like Rav Nachman, that the only form of valid chalipin is with a kli, because that's what the pasuk says. If you're going to say that, then umatbeya b'teres damim k'mar Lakish lo kani. Then a matbeya, which according to Rish Lakish is not kani, it doesn't count. The nistik Rav Nachman, the Omar yesh damim shehen kechalipin. There is money that is like chalipin. The whole Rish Lakish midaraisa yalav the most enukonos. So according to Rav Shlokish, even a mekach, the unorthodox way of making a transaction, which we then say shows that money can become chalipin, you can't use it because money inherently can't be used in the transaction for anything. So the fact that there's money there excludes it from chalipin. Therefore, according to Rish Lakish, Rab Nachman cannot say that here's my interpretation of the Mishnah, that when you trade a chamor for a shor, you're trading money in chalipin. You can't say that according to Rish Lakish, because Rish Lakish says money can never be used in a transaction. Therefore, the sleight of hands that we're calling money in the case of the shor chamor is vitiated. It's knocked out. You can't use it. So again, it's a little complicated, but now we're back. That's why the Gemara says we're back to square one. This can only work according to Rav Nachman, or according to Rish Lakish if he holds like Rav Sheshes. But we wanted to say that Rish Lakish held like Rav Nachman can't be. If he doesn't hold like Rav Nachman, then we've negated the proof that money can be used for chalipin because of this milsa de lo shlicha, because we're saying you can't hold up Rav Nachman because money can never be used in the transaction. You can't. Money has no value in that transaction. Therefore, there's no milsa de lo shlicha where you're going to translate the money into chalipin. So we wiped out again, and we're once again back to square one, where we have no proof that money can be used for chalipin, and that's where, unfortunately, that's where we come out now. Okay, now, so before we depart from this, now let's just take another quick look. So we're at the point where we have no proof that money can be used for chalipin, right? Because we're saying that he can't hold like Rav Nachman, because Rav Nachman would hold like Rish Lakish that money has no, there's no, money can never be kona. Money can never be kona, then using the unorthodox milsa de lo shchicha has no kiyum. It doesn't have any legs to it. Now, so now the Gemara says, fine, but we're still not going to give up on the theory that money can be used for chalipin. Why? Tanan, we learned in our Mishnah, if you go back to the very beginning of our Mishnah in Hazov, what is that first Mishnah, after going through everything, what does the Mishnah say? The Mishnah says, we'll take a quick look, the Mishnah says, Kol metaltalin konin zeh ez zeh. Mishnah says, metaltalin can acquire each other. In other words, you can use metaltalin for metaltalin. Okay, we didn't say chalipin, we didn't say sale, we just used the word metaltalin. Metaltalin is not a kli. Metaltalin is not a kli. So if the Mishnah now says metaltalin kona zeh zeh, v'omer Resh Lakish, and Resh Lakish interprets those words in the Mishnah, va'afilu kis molemos v'kis molemos. If I have a pocketbook or a wallet of money and I exchange it for another wallet of money, that's an example of metaltalin konin zeh zeh. That's an example of a metaltalin, of a movable object that acquires one metaltalin from the other. And his example is kis malei mos, kis malei mos. So now, if you're going to say that, then wait a minute. That's proof that money can be used for chalipin, because we want to give an example of chalipin. Says the Mishnah metaltalin konin zeh zeh. Not like Reb Nachman, who says you have to have a kli, but you can have a metaltalin, an item. So if I have an item and I exchange it for another item, that's chalipin. It just so happens that there is money in that item. There's a money full of coins, and I'm exchanging one wallet of coins for another wallet of coins. Says the Gemara here, wait a minute. That's proof that money can be used for chalipin, because you have both money being exchanged for money, right? And money is the item of the exchange. So we had two different questions. We had a question, can money be used for chalipin? And regardless of what you say, whether money can be used for chalipin, can a coin be the object of chalipin? In other words, can you do a chalipin with a coin being the object? Two separate questions. This answers both of them. According to that Mishnah, if you say metaltalin, which means a kis malemos, a wallet full of money, can be exchanged for another wallet full of money, we see then that money can be used for chalipin because we're exchanging money, and the object of the chalipin is the money. So we've now taken two birds with one stone, and we said both of them are now a proof. We've been sort of going back and forth, and every time we find a way of saying yes, we slug it up and say no. The Mishnah itself, from the very beginning, if we look at it carefully, will have told us that you can do it. Says Rashi, Vafilu kis malemos, right? The third line from the long line. Even a kis malemos. We have to be talking about chalipin in the Mishnah. The Ibitaras damim mos lokani. Because according to Resh Lakish, this is what Resh Lakish speaking. According to Resh Lakish, he argues on Rabbi Yochanan and says money is not konet. So it has to be what? It has to be chalipin. And if it's chalipin, then we just proven that money can be used for chalipin, and it can be the object of the chalipin, both. The Ibitar is most lokoni, shemamina, matbeya nasa chalipin, that a matbeya, a coin, can make chalipin, v'nikta b'chalipin. and money can be acquired with chalipin. So both of the questions that we've been having all these many weeks and understanding is answered in one fell swoop by this line of the Mishnah. Says this is the kasha. So we're saying, Tanan, our Mishnah is proof positive. We've overlooked this all this time. We're going back and forth with Milsad Lo Shchicha and this dray and that dray. You don't need it. The Mishnah itself, on the face of it, says Metaltal and Konin Zeh. Right? It couldn't have been a better proof. Says the Gemara, not so fast. Okay? Again, it's kind of every time we think we've nailed it, now the Gemara is going to pull back and say, no, that's not a proof. Why is it not a proof? Targuma Rav Acha interprets that when it says kis mole mos bediner anka va'anigra, it's talking about not a regular money coin that we are used to. It's talking about an anka va'anigra. What is an anka va'anigra? So let's take a quick look because we're going to interpret this in greater detail. So let's look at the Gemara. Anka v'anigra. Echad shepsulaso malchus ve'echad shepsulaso medina. So these are two different coins, one of which let's call it the federal government comes out and says a silver dollar is no longer a monetary coin in our realm. You can't use it as money. So that's what we call anka. Anka means that the authorities came and said that what you used to think was money is no longer money. But it can, on the black market, on the underground, it's money. In other words, officially it's not money, but unofficially it's money. A nigra is psulaso medina. Let's say Maryland came out and said, we're no longer honoring a silver dollar. The other 49 states say it's a perfectly good coin, but in Maryland, it's no longer a good coin. That's called a nigra. So what is his answer? His answer is that these coins that were in the kiss, that were in the pocketbook, are either prohibited on a larger scale by the government or prohibited on a smaller scale by the Medina, by the state. Therefore, because that's the case, you can't say that money can be used for chalipin because it's no longer money, it is a chayfetz. What are you going to do with a silver dollar that has silver, but is no longer a coin of the realm? You're going to say, okay, I can't use it for money, but it still has a gram of silver or whatever it is. Therefore, it's worth something. But that's not money anymore. That's produce. So if you say anke va'angira, whether it's the Medina or the federal, either way, that coin is no longer money. Therefore, you can't bring a raya from the Mishnah that money can be used for chalipin because we're not talking about money. We're talking about a chayfetz, an item that has sort of been devalued and is no longer money. Okay, it's clear that we thought, we now have metaltalin with money in it, proof positive that money can be used for chalipin. Says Rav Acha, no, because we're not talking about coins that are used for money. We're talking about coins that have been devalued that are used for chalipin. Now, okay, v'tzricha. We'll learn the Rashi in a minute. So now the Gemara asks Akasha v'tzricha. Why does Rav Acha have to give us two examples of anko v'angira? It was stripped of its value federally or stripped of its value locally, Medina. Why both? Says the Gemara as follows. If you were to say that the federal government devalued the coin, mishum de lo saga klal, because it has no longer any value, Ava Medina, the sagale, right? In other words, if you're going to say that you were disqualified from a federal coin, because the Gemara, because the Gemara doesn't, because the coin is no longer valued, right? Abu Psalto Medina, but a coin of the Medina, the Sagale Medina Achriti, which can be used, let's say, in New York, not Delaware. Emasai, Ema Akati Matbeyahu. So I might say, if I only excluded, the Gemara asks the question, why do I have to give you Ankavan here? So as the Gemara, I have to include both in the exclusion. If I excluded only the Anke, the federal coin, and I didn't exclude the Medina coin, and you were trading one for the other, then you would say, you know what? Okay, federally it's no longer a coin, but in the Medina it's a coin. If it's a Medina and the coin, it's still a proof that you can exchange a coin for a coin, because in the Medina it's a coin. The Ashmin himself, the Medina, and if we were only taught that it was no longer valid in the state because Maryland said you can't use it, we should have the Sagale because the state of Maryland doesn't allow you to use it, period. But the coin of the Malchus, the Sagale Betsina, where we said that even though people don't use it as a means of a transaction, but they use it on the black market because it still has value as a coin, right? I might say it's a matbeya, right? The ein matbeya nikta b'chalipin, and we're going to say ein matbeya nikta b'chalipin. So in other words, what the Gemara is saying here is we need to disqualify both, because according to Rav Ache, since he says Anka v'Angira, that it was two different coins that they were exchanging, so the Gemara says, okay, so that's proof that it's not a coin, it's a product. But wait a minute. So let's just say Anka, or let's just say Angira. Says the Gemara, you can't just say one because of the other. If you're saying this is not a coin, the other may be a coin. And if you're going to say that the other isn't a coin, then maybe there still is a coin, and you can, in other words, if you didn't exclude both, I still might have thought using one, the Anka or the Angira, we could bring a raya that money is used for Halipin. Therefore, the Gemara says you can't use either. Okay, so again, b'tzricha di ashminim psalta malchus mishum l'sage klal. Avo psalta medina d'sage lebe medina achrite ema akati matbeyahu, and we're saying that the Mishnah says you're allowing it. The emat beya nikna b'chalipin. The ashminim psalta medina, and if you're only saying that it's possible in the Medina nikna b'chalipin, the ashminim psalta medina mishum d'lo sagale. Because in the Medina you can no longer use it. But a federally devalued coin can still be used as on the market. Ema akati matbeyahu. We're going to say it's matbeya. The ein matbeya nikta b'chalipin. Therefore tzricha. Therefore the Gemara tells us we have to have both of them. That either one is coming to tell us that a coin cannot be used for chalip. So that's how the Gemara ends that temporary reprieve where we thought, we have a chap from the Mishnah that shows money can be used for chalipin. Says the Gemara, under no circumstance. So let's just learn the Rashi. Tagamar Rav Acha b'shtei and mos psulos. In both cases, the money was possible. The havalei kishar metalpulin. All of a sudden, it became a regular metalpulin. Machlav kis moledinra. Anikon bikis male shaldinrim anikra. You're exchanging produce for produce. That's chalipin, but there's no proof that money can be exchanged, right? So now Rashi explains: Echem mamsulta malchus, echem mamsulta medina. Hamelach goza, the king, meaning federal, shelo yatziu, that you shouldn't use it. B'nei medina lo can also behatzno, but the Medina, sort of surreptitiously in the black market, kept using it. The Echad Mehem sold to Medina, B'nai Medina said no. The B'nai Medina said no, we're not using this. The king didn't disqualify the coin. In New York, in Connecticut, in all the other states, we say that it's valid. So again, once again, we've tried a last gasp effort to find a way for a coin to become an object of chalipin, and Rav Acha chilled that by saying that no, that Gemara isn't talking about real money. It's talking about money that was disqualified either federally or locally, and therefore you can't consider it money. You have to consider it produce. Produce is okay for chalipin, but it's no raya that money can be used for chalipin. So again, as I said before, the Gemara is relentless in trying to find different interpretations that money can be used for chalipin. And we thought we had one right here, and the Gemara shot it down by saying, not according to Rav Acha, who interprets our Gemara, that a kiss male dinner doesn't mean it was full of money. It was full of something that had been disqualified as money, and therefore cannot be used. Therefore, it's no proof that money can be used for chalipin. So again, we're now back to basics, and next week I think we're gonna have another shot at it. We're gonna try again to find a way. But the Gemara just absolutely wants to find a way here that money can be used for chalipin, and is being thwarted at every twist and turn. So once again, we're back to square one. All right, Yishkoyach. Yeah, next week we'll the continuing saga of money and chalipin. It's next week.